So I was going to open this by saying, do you trust the AIs that you're using? I think after Anna's talk, we've already had lots of food for thought of some of the reasons maybe AI isn't quite as trustworthy as we might originally assume. So I'm going to talk a bit about avoiding bias, but also looking at some principles more generally for how we can build a framework for using AI responsibly. Can you all hear me all right? Is this working? So my name's Jo Stansfield. I'm a trustee of the BCS, which is the Chartered Institute for IT in the UK. So hopefully some of you will know the BCS. And I'm also board member of a charity called For Humanity, which is an AI ethics charity building independent audit in AI systems. So I'll start with a very, very, very brief history of AI. But really, the first thing I'd like to just say is, isn't AI astonishing? I was talking to a colleague about giving this talk about responsible innovation, and they said, well, Jo, surely that horse has already bolted. I thought, oh, well, there's definitely an image in there, isn't there? So I went and had a play with Midjourney, asked it to visualize for me a picture of an AI horse that had bolted off into the distance. And this is just what it came up with. Now, it's showing quite a lovely kind of sunny future here. Now, if we just wind back a little bit to the beginnings of AI, it kind of feels like AI is a really new thing, doesn't it? It's suddenly exploded into our collective consciousness. In the last few years with ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, and all of the rest of them. But actually, did you know that AI goes back to the 1950s? The term artificial intelligence was coined all the way back then. And the technologies that are behind Midjourney and ChatGPT was actually also begun back in the 1950s. And what's really changed is that huge explosion in the compute power, the availability of big data, so these algorithms can now develop really, really rapidly. And I think when we think about it in those terms, it can kind of make us question, actually, how intelligent is it really? It might be extremely powerful, but is there really intelligence behind it? And I think that presumption of intelligence, the name says so, right? It's on the tin, can lead us to have trust in AI that isn't necessarily earned. It isn't necessarily worthy of that trust. So coming from all of this explosion in AI and possibility for small business owners to make exciting images to put on big screens, we've got kind of two different camps of what does this AI future look like. We've got our lovely, sunny, happy future here, where AI is augmenting everything that people do. It's giving us huge amounts of new possibility. It's helping innovation. We're going to transform people's lives and give opportunities to people across society. But then we also have this really dark view. We've got our dystopian future view. And I don't know how many of you remember, last year there was an open letter that was shared by leaders of quite a few different AI firms, including Elon Musk, warning about the dangers of AI let loose, this dystopian future potential where actually maybe it leads to an explosion in development of chemical weapons. Maybe it is about human enfeeblement, that we're so dependent we can't do anything anymore. And they called for a pause on the development of AI because it's so dangerous, we can't possibly keep going without having addressed those risks. Now, I'm not a subscriber in this, by the way. I'm not an AI dystopian sort of future doomsayer. But what I'd like to talk about today is very much some of the present day risks, because there's an awful lot of things that we're already beginning to see happening with AI that's causing harm, bias, as Anna was talking about, that needs to be managed and mitigated today. So that's really what I'm going to be focusing on in this. And some of the reasons that matters, again, as Anna touched on, AI is absolutely everywhere. Is there anyone in this room who hasn't knowingly used AI at this point? I'm not sure anyone would put their hands up, but I'm guessing every single one of you has had some experiments using ChatGPT or some of the image generators or other AI tools. But it's also there behind the scenes in many of our everyday services and products. And I've got a little mind map on screen there of just some of the different ways that it's used. So across finance, employment, entry systems to get into buildings, unlocking your phone. It's used in military, it's used in security scans, it's used by the police. It's absolutely everywhere. And the depth of use of that AI, it might just be there to provide some information that supports a decision or some info that's been generated to be used. Actually, it could be there a bit more intentionally to provide a nudge. You should be doing this. This is a recommended course of action. Or it might be there to actually make an autonomous decision. So an example, going back to Anna's talk, that is one that worries me quite a lot in employment: tools for scanning people's CVs when you apply for a job. You're meant to have human looking over it, but it can just decide. Is somebody actually really thinking about the decisions that the AI is making? Or is it being left to make decisions autonomously? So this leads to the question, we may be placing trust in all of these AI systems, but are they really trustworthy? I don't know how many of you have heard a term called automation bias, but this comes back to that sense that, it's an algorithm, it's clever. It's learned from lots of clever stuff, so it knows what it's doing. And we kind of subconsciously will trust a recommendation that's given to us by an algorithm far more than necessarily we should. So what do we need to be thinking about to make sure that the AI tools we're using are genuinely trustworthy? So what I'd like to do is talk you through some of the principles of responsible AI. Now, this is a framework that's kind of mashed together from a few different frameworks. I'll talk through some of those as we get to them. So this is, what I find to be a more understandable way in to some of these principles, but these are echoed through the UK government made a white paper about AI innovation. They laid out principles for responsible innovation, also some echoes in the EU AI Act and other governance frameworks that are emerging for AI. So without wanting to repeat too much of what we've all just heard about, I'd like to start by looking a bit more about fairness and non-bias and ensuring non-discrimination in the tools that we have. And I found this lovely video from the London Interdisciplinary School that I'd like to play you to illustrate this point. How long do I give it before I ask Jean Carlo for help?
This is why you should avoid mixing Barbie with biased AI image generators. What does a typical prisoner look like? What about a lawyer, a nurse, a drug dealer? What about a fast food worker, a cleaner, a terrorist, or a CEO? These are all images created by an artificial intelligence image generator called Midjourney, which creates unique images based off of simple word prompts. These exaggerated biases that AI systems create are known as representational harms. These are harms which degrade certain social groups by reinforcing the status quo or by amplifying stereotypes. A particularly extreme example was created when BuzzFeed published an article of AI-generated Barbies from different countries around the world. The Barbies from Latin America were all presented as fair-skinned, perpetuating a form of discrimination known as colorism, where lighter skin tones are favoured over darker ones. The Barbie from Germany was dressed in clothes reminiscent of an SS Nazi uniform, and the Barbie from South Sudan was depicted holding a rifle by her side. We need to be educated and intentional about how we use AI image generators. As computer scientist and digital activist Joy Balamwini puts it, whether AI will help us reach our aspirations or reinforce unjust inequalities is ultimately up to us. What are some examples of representational harms you've come across recently?
Isn't that a brilliant video? It's funny, but it's also not funny. I find generative AI is a really fascinating tool to explore because it shows us back what biases it's learned. But all of these other AI systems that we have that don't tell us things like this back out again have been trained on the same data that's come from the same society and a whole set of the same assumptions underneath it. So, although this is a very entertaining video, it also makes a very serious point.
So, Jo, one quick question.
Yeah, sure.
For the big LLMs,
Yeah.
this fixable?
This is why you should avoid...
Let me come on to that. I'm going to come to that in a minute, okay? So I've got a few examples just to share of systems that have been in the news that aren't generative AI, but are AI systems that have shown high-profile cases where bias has impacted the outputs and the outcomes from those systems. And you may well remember some of these. There's one in the news, I think maybe 4 or 5 years back, about Twitter cropping photos so that it was only showing a highlight of a single person. And what they found was that it always cropped to the white faces. In fact, I think there was a case where President Obama was even cut out of a photo in a preview that Twitter had made. Now, I'm very interested in EDI as well. Yeah, it's a topic that I care an awful lot for, and a lot of my work is around EDI. So looking at how tools can impact different groups of people, especially in AI hiring or in decisions made about healthcare, is really important. So, some examples on screen here. There've been some there's been some lawsuits already against big AI firms like Workday, one of the leading HR systems, looking at actually is its tools perpetuating discrimination against disability based on people's age, based on their race and ethnicity, based on their gender. You can see a headline on screen as well. The same questions are there around healthcare tools. Are our healthcare systems and improvements really equally benefiting everybody across society, or is that favouring particular groups where the research has maybe been focused? And a particularly alarming one here about a black woman who was wrongly arrested at 8 months pregnant because a facial ID tech misidentified her. And people actually acted on that, and they arrested her for something that she had no involvement with. So hopefully this will talk a little bit to your question about how do we actually identify that these biases are happening, where do they arise from, and what can we do about it? Now, this is a really tricky question. And I think often the starting point people think about is, or people talk about it at any rate, is, well, is there a technical fix we can make? Now, I used to be in a role responsible for people data systems in a big tech company. AI vendors would phone me up reasonably often and try and sell me their AI solutions. And I'd always enjoy asking them questions about, how do we know if there's going to be any potential for bias in the outputs of this? How can we identify that, and how can we mitigate the risks? Rather alarmingly, the answer I very often got from them was something along the lines of, well, we've got really clever developers, they didn't put any bias into it. But what I'm trying to show with this diagram here is why that's a very overly simplistic answer. And yes, of course, there is going to be some amount of technical solution to this, but it is not a purely technical problem. So if we start with our orange arrow there at the top, we start in a world that is not equal, right? We know that we're in a world where there is bias and there is discrimination. We then go to collect data for our AI systems that will capture inequality in that data that's already existing in society. But actually, depending on the way we ask the questions, the problems that we're forming, that can introduce yet more bias and expectation about certain things to go looking for in that data. It can introduce bias through who we ask. For example, is our data set all white people? Have we forgotten to include people who have got different ethnic backgrounds? It happens, right? Are we annotating the data? Have people introduced the potential for cognitive bias in the way that that data is annotated? We then come into how the algorithms are designed. Who's part of that team? How are they forming the problems? What process are they going through to design the solutions? What choice of algorithms are they making? How are they testing it? Who's involved in testing it? Then we can also come to how are we deploying those systems? So even a system that's made it this far through the cycle and has really had great answers to those questions can still be misused. It can still be deployed in ways that can perpetuate harm and discrimination. An example that I find really relevant for this one is there's an app called ShotSpotter that has been deployed by the police in the States, which is essentially listens in neighborhoods to detect if there's gunshots. If there are gunshots, then police can be deployed to have quick, rapid response to address whatever the incident is. But in choosing where to deploy this system, the police in certain cities chose to deploy it predominantly in the black African American neighborhoods. So what does it find? More potential gunshots in Black African American neighborhoods, reinforcing that expectation that, there's criminality within the Black neighborhoods that is not justified, but has arisen because of the choices that they made about how to deploy that AI. That then leads to unequal outcomes, biased decisions and interventions as a result, which then feeds back into that real world equality and discrimination. So I'm afraid that doesn't give a very nice, easy answer of how do we address it. But it does highlight that this isn't a purely technical problem. It's what they call a socio-technical system, and it needs a socio-technical solution. So I'd like to just move on and quickly go through some of these other principles for responsible AI development and adoption. I'm sorry, I've totally lost time, so I'm not quite sure how long I've got. All right. So what I'm going to do is show you some of the real-life news that has come about addressing each of these principles and talk about some of the examples that hopefully highlights why these matter and how they're relevant now. So transparency, explainability, and accessibility. Well, what's that about? Now, this isn't an AI example, but I think this is a really important current day example that's happening right now, which is the Post Office Horizon scandal. So I'm sure you will have all have seen the news that hundreds and hundreds of sub-postmasters were wrongly accused, convicted, jailed. Some have lost their lives through suicide as a result, essentially, of bugs in a computer system that was not transparent. It was not accessible for them to use it. It was not explainable that this bug existed. As a result of poor governance around this system, prosecutions were able to go through. And actually, there's a quirk in the UK law that means that computer system evidence is treated as correct, despite the fact that everybody who works and has ever made computer software knows, actually, it really isn't. That's not what I'd expect from it at all. Now, what I find particularly important about this case is how this is not a high-tech WYSI system. This isn't even AI, to be honest. But in AI systems, we have a black box. We don't know how it works. If it's giving us answers that people are acting on that can lead to consequences that impact people's lives and their livelihoods, we need to know how those decisions are made. It needs to be explainable. That's what has been lacking in this post office case, that presumption that the system was correct. And that is a huge, huge risk with AI systems going forwards, that we don't know how it has made the decisions that it makes. Okay, next one, privacy, data protection, and safety. Now, I'm probably one of the few people in the room who gets excited about GDPR and thinks, yeah, that's actually really important. That data protection piece matters a lot. So here's some real-world examples of how privacy, data protection, and safety can actually be impacted by AI systems. Well, we've talked about ChatGPT, and Giancarlo gave a nice example about how actually we can protect our privacy settings in that now. But that wasn't the case at the beginning. Data you put into ChatGPT is retained by the system. It is not going to necessarily respect privacy law. Won't necessarily respect anything confidential about your company, by the way, either. So if you want to put anything proprietary in there, be very careful about what you're telling it. Now, some other examples. Clearview AI was a really high-profile case. Well, I think even still going on now, but a few years back, they received huge fines from the Information Commission's Office for breaching GDPR. What it does, it's a tool for the police and for law enforcement to be able to carry out facial recognition, essentially based on everybody. It scraped images from social media, from the internet, and provided means to identify people to law enforcement. I don't think any of us consented to that. That's not all right as far as GDPR goes. And Clearview AI received enormous fines, and they now can't operate in many countries as a result of that. An example about safety. Airport scanners, the ones you walk through and it scans your body as you go through, that uses AI. And it uses AI to mask and maintain your privacy when you walk through it. Now, for transgender passengers, That's pretty risky, actually, because it doesn't necessarily correctly identify their gender and can cause a privacy issue. This is a very public place and can cause a safety issue as well. This is not a safe world we're in for transgender friends and colleagues. Right, validity, accuracy, and reliability. You certainly hope that these things are true. Validity meaning it measures what it says it measures. Accuracy, reliability, does it always measure correctly over time? Now this one I found kind of amusing, but kind of not amusing at the same time. An AI hiring tool found that recorded video interviews made assessments of candidates based on their video input. If you sat in front of a bookcase, it rated you as more intelligent and more suitable for the job. Good tip, everybody. Another employment-related one in terms of the accuracy and reliability. Uber drivers, a couple of years back, realized that it was asking them to identify themselves before taking a piece of work. It wouldn't give work to drivers unless it had validated their identity. Drivers with darker skin tones were finding that at night time, it didn't recognize them. So they were denied work because the system could not recognize them in dark settings. Now, one of the reasons to kind of pay attention to this as a business owner is we're actually liable for what we use and inaccurate results. There was a case very recently, just back in February, where Air Canada were held responsible for nonsense that its chatbot was putting out. In fact, a passenger had asked it about some fare reductions for a bereavement policy. It gave them false information. They claimed money back that Air Canada wouldn't then give them because it wasn't actually their policy. It went to court. Air Canada were made to pay back the money and to pay the legal fees and expenses. They were actually responsible for what its chatbot was telling its customers. Okay, next one, ethical supply chain. How does our AI data get there? How does it get annotated? Well, there's a lot of unscrupulous practice that is potentially happening there in far more impoverished parts of the world. We can also look at the environmental footprint. So this here on screen says that the world's data centers consume about 2.5 to 3.7% of global greenhouse gases. And in fact, generating one image with Gen AI uses the same amount of power as charging your smartphone. Overall, the power cost of Gen AI is around the same as a small country, and that's due to double by 2026. These are not insignificant. Obviously, it's not happening in our house. We can forget about it very easily, but that footprint is there. We also need to think about the intellectual property aspects. How does ChatGPT and other Gen AI know everything it does? It's taken information from the internet that was not shared for that purpose. And artists, authors are now querying, actually, how do we stop it from using our work and reproducing our work? So how do we address this? As we talked about, it's not purely a technical problem. It's about having good governance, oversight, and having the ability to redress any issues that do come from it. That involves the training. That involves people actually having assigned accountability in businesses, a way to report incidents, and to have them rectified. Now, the EU AI Act is some law that's just coming into force. If any of you are interested to know more about that, I can share more in the break, but I'll move on now. So really, just to wrap up, we talked about 6 principles for responsible AI. But we can also think about this rather than just about risk mitigation. This is about a benefit to businesses. If we can implement these principles, and of course, each system and each use is different, we can use these as a framework to assess what we're doing and how. And the benefits are that our AI is going to be trustworthy. That's going to be far more appealing to our clients, to our employees, and it's going to help to make sure that we are really demonstrating our business values. So thank you very much, everybody.